so that people are situated here. The literature on natural language generation encompasses systems, summarization, text simplification, anything where you're generating text that we did before. But just to situate this in the literature at large. So what is the task for faithful abstractive summarization evaluation, for example? The task is to produce summaries based on a single or multiple documents in a collection of documents. And faithful summaries are expected to be reflective of the source, and only the source, with no hallucinations, no extra frills, typically in a single language. So this has been sort of like the rubric for evaluating faithful abstractive summarization. Mind you, it doesn't say much about coverage of all the information in the source, as long as it doesn't insert unwarranted information. So this is different from machine translation. So, you can cover as much or as little of the original source. Obviously, you want to cover as much of it, but you want to make it succinct. And you want to also not hallucinate, add stuff that doesn't exist in the source. So this relates to a lot of work that I had been involved in over the past couple of years, where we looked at this problem very closely. And especially if you're using pre-trained language models in our field now, which is a big effort, you end up getting very plausible output that's kind of related to the summary, to the topic of the summary, but it might not have been attested for in the actual document collection that you've had. So this is where faithfulness comes in. So an era of ethical awareness. What do I mean by that? So we would like to, some of our desiderata here, equality. And this is a definition inspired by responsible AI within Facebook. It caters groups and languages, including vernaculars, with their people equally and minimize. It's a responsible AI. A deliberate decision to prioritize outcomes for the disenfranchised, avoid harm and minimize bias, minimize misrepresentation, meaning going beyond basic equity and equality, address increase transparency, so clearly communicate the quality reflecting our confidence in the generated text. So faithfulness. It serves ethical considerations better than current common MT mindset, optimizing for adequacy and fluency only. So just I'll situate this again in where we are currently in machine translation as a natural language generation paradigm. So state-of-the-art machine translation today, sound in Arabic, هذا البرنامج يجمع output of I'd say in surmise that this is an excellent translation. So really doing well. Why do we need anything else, right? So let's take a look at this again. If we just back translated this into Arabic, listen what we أجمع هذا البرنامج في أمريكا بين معلمي اللغة الإنجليزية المحللين ومعلمين من جميع أنحاء العالم لمدة 6 أسابيع لتدريبهم على أحدث طرق تدريس اللغة الإنجليزية. I would actually even say that the back translation is actually better Arabic than the source. So, we're doing so well. It's like, wow, the technology is right there. And if you look but let's take a look closer at current state of the art for machine translation in industry. This was a study that was done by Intento in 2018. So it's almost late now. It's almost old now, but this is, they just came up with something recently, but around some other technology. So the overall performance here is like basically the data, the performance looks like it looks really good. So if you look at the y-axis here, this tells you the performance in like it's a special metric that's called H-Lipor. Forget about the actual metric, but the point is, if you look at DeepL, Google, IBM, Microsoft, IBM again, SDL, Baidu, Sistran. For lots of languages, so for 15 languages, we're almost at 70% performance. For 48 languages, Google is at around 70, 68, 69, and so on and so forth. So we're doing pretty well. And this was done for 48 language pairs, where each pair had around 900 to 3,000 sentences. And it tells you the variance, and the error bars here tells you the variance between the different different language pairs, sorry. The data was mostly edited text, including WMT. WMT is the Workshop on Machine Translation, which technically is a conference, and it serves as the reference point for machine translation evaluation frameworks. And the metric here is a human rapport, which is a variant of BLEU, which is basically looking at n-gram overlaps, as well as brevity penalties and so on. So looking at this again from another perspective for the same study, basically this tells you what's going on. So this is for English, Russian, Japanese, German, Spanish, French, Portuguese, all the better. And the worse we get, it turns into this orange reddish color. And you would see that, for example, Arabic is in the yellow side of things. So in general, XX to English, whatever language to English, achieved higher performance than English to XX, except for Japanese and Turkish. English to XX, much lower for low resource languages. So like Czech, Turkish, Finnish, Korean, and Arabic. So basically English into these languages is much more difficult, and probably it has to do with the morphology. Non-English directions, 16 out of 18 show much poorer performance. And out of the 12 machine translation systems considered, only a max 6 systems were considered competitive, so similar to French, Spanish. The majority of the directions had only 2 systems that are competitive, 22 out of 48. So the state of the art is not as good as we think it is. That's the bottom line. That's the bottom line message that I'm trying to get. So back to our example. If you look at this specific example, this is really well-edited, well-formed modern standard Arabic data. So the quality of the translation here is very good for this type of data. But let's take a look at reality. And this is when things start hitting, the rubber hits the road. So this is state of the art now on social media. And just the red is supposed to indicate how bad it is. The green is what the human translation would have given you here. So let's take a look from Arabic to English. They provided here through the link. It should have been apply here through the link. So completely misleading. English, French, don't forget to hit me up. It ends up being don't hesitate to hit me, as opposed to don't hesitate to contact me. So it can end up being a completely different sense. And again, you see this for Turkish English, so you have without pressure and a bad word, without ringing and pressing. And then, for example, super relate, silent treatment to the max, ends up being super tattasil, as opposed to أنا معاك بالضبط أتجاهل لأقصى الحدود. So you end up different ones. And for example, the last one, ARch again. And let me show you some. So this is Tunisian Arabic. Sauvegarder le fichier. It ends up being, transliterated as opposed to save the file. Vote him out became صوت صالحه, and as opposed to خرجوه بالانتخابات. So vote for him. So gave you the complete opposite sense. So these problems are really, really problematic, right? Because it could mislead people in a completely different direction, and especially if people are not bilinguals. So you can think about this from a responsibility perspective. You're misleading your audience, your users, into a completely different sense of what's actually originally intended, and it could create actually wars. So we at Facebook had a situation where we mistranslated and it was publicly known, we mistranslated the birthday of somebody by a dignitary in a country by saying they died, and that created a huge hoopla. So having these, quote unquote mistakes is a big problem. Now, let me tell you another angle for this as well. Translations from vernaculars is really bad quality. So we did a test actually at Facebook, where this paper was published last year, where colleagues of mine looked at African-American English and how the performance is if you're not trained on African-American vernacular. What would be the performance of a system that's trained on English, a very good system? What would be the performance if a dialectal variation, specifically the vernacular of African-American English, was given as test data? And across the board, these are 3 systems for African-American English, where the performance, translation quality, using top off-the-shelf machine translation for African American English. To French, the blue versus percentage of AAE present in the source, we see a downward slope across the board. And the downward slope indicates really worse performance. So there is a bias inherently in this system. Why should Well, 62% in the US get their news from social media, according to a study by Pew Foundation. And the number of users who get their news from social media platforms in the United States has risen actually from 28% to 34%. And globally, 77% of internet users rely on social media for their news. So it's a very important source of information, especially in countries where you don't have like open, transparent, trustworthy media outlets. So social media serves an extremely pertinent role in these communities. So if you don't have, and especially if it's not just English, they don't have access to English, they would like to see language, like the news in their own language. So they tend to use machine translation. So if the machine translation is not reliable, then you have a serious problem. So just to drive this point even further, we note that across the board, non-English speakers have a huge percentage of their populations who are using social media for their daily use. So in terms of total population worldwide, we know there are 7.79 billion people. Unique mobile phone users are 5.9 billion users. Active social media users are around almost 4 billion people. So this is a staggering number. I know that, for example, Facebook, our reach is around 3.7 billion people. So this is a staggering number across the world. And also, it's it's been noted that Generation Z and millennials, together with digital consumers in the Middle East and Latin America, have been the driving force behind recent increases in social media consumption. So it's the younger generation that are actually using social media excessively. So Instagram, WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok now, Clubhouse, all of these apps are like front and center for these people's communications. So why should we care? We generate, as Facebook, we generate across our family of apps, 20 billion daily translations. This is not an exaggerated number, and this was sanctioned for this talk back in 2020. So this means that we're actually even at a higher number, but the point that I'm trying to make here, it's a staggering amount of sheer number of translations. So basically, the experience we want to show is how you get the data in one language, you get to see exactly the same experience in another language. So this is in native, like French, Japanese, and English. You want to see it in English, maybe. You want to see it in some other language. But and you want to have like the Turkish viewers see it in Turkish for them, for example, right? So what is the current mindset? So I hope we motivated why this is an important problem. What is the current mindset? Currently, we just focus on two dimensions when we evaluate machine translation. We focus on fluency and adequacy, and sort of like the overlap between them. The current mindset is where we have a source signal. It goes through some kind of black box right now, especially that we use deep learning methods and so on. There's very little interpretability of what happens inside here, but then you end up with a translation. But note here, we're missing some of the signal on this side. But actually, there is a study that came out in late 2020 in Nature Communications, where they did a very comprehensive study of machine translation performance for specifically one language pair, English to Czech, which is a low resource language, but it was specifically for Newswire. And they found across different modalities, different metrics and so on, that they're doing, fluency and adequacy seem to be doing a really good job. And they've measured it very thoroughly, and that's why it was in Nature. And it shows that adequacy is higher than fluency. But the point is, it did a really excellent job. But again, it was one language pair, Newswire. So this is for edited text. So ideally, what we want to do in our enterprise as a research enterprise, we'd like to ideally shoot for what I call the North Star, where you have a signal source and you get a completely authentic, faithful output on the other side with a glass box model, right? So you have a gray, or even I would say glass box model, where you actually understand what's happening. And this goes into interpretability and explainability, which is also part of responsible AI, but I'm not going to talk about this today. This is not going to be focus of the talk. But what I would like to talk about is what is faithful MT. No, it's not about just prayers and supplications. It's about producing machine translation that is faithful to the source, reflecting the exact meaning of the source with no additions, aka hallucinations, no deletions, and no egregious substitutions. So going beyond translationese. What it is not a judgment on the veridicality of the content. So we're not judging whether the source was true or not. It's not a judgment on the provenance of the source. So we're not saying whether it came from an authentic source or not. That's the job of something else. And that's still responsible AI, but that's a different type of responsibility and ethical AI and so on. So in a nutshell, faithful translation is about achieving meaning, expression, and usage equivalence with the source while maintaining minimal distance. So what is my proposal? It's a mindset shift, moving beyond the minimal viable product, which is what we usually call in industry MVP. So the basic minimums mindset to adopting a faithfulness mindset. Go beyond adequate meaning and fluency to include usage considerations. What I mean by that is specifically linguistic pragmatics. So think about emotional intensity reflecting the trends that we have downstream, as they have downstream implications. The level of formality and coherence in a post is part of the message. Use of idiomatic expressions convey cultural nuance. Hedging in a message has implications, deception detection. Sarcasm, irony, humor, hate speech versus humor versus hate speech detection, for example. Especially pertinent in social media and opinion data, because this tends to be, user-generated data is subjective data by definition. What are the potential implications of shifting our mindset? If we adopt faithfulness mindset, it allows us to think of other approaches to evaluation. So it becomes more task-based evaluation settings. It serves as a forcing function toward building more interpretable models. So remember that glass box that I had a couple of slides ago? That would be, a forcing function to have us try to probe the model better and try to figure out why are we failing, why are we doing a good job, and so on and so forth. So this is the proposed mindset. So remember my previous slide had the fluency adequacy, and faithfulness becomes the big umbrella. But there's a part of this that also needs to be addressed, which is about plausibility. So that's important as an aspect. What is plausibility? Plausibility beyond fluency refers to how likely is a translation to appear in a target language. So just to give you an example, you made my day, gets translated into Inta sanata yawmi. Doesn't mean anything. If you're a native Arabic speaker who doesn't speak English and can figure out that this has something to do with you made my day, verbatim, it means you build the correct translation should be something like farrahtini in Egyptian Arabic, for example. Faithfulness beyond fluency. Typically, we aim for fluency in the target, almost ignoring source fluency. However, in social media, speech effects play a pragmatic role. So, بحب الكورة قوي, the fluent translation would be, I love football, but a faithful translation would be like, I love football, or I love football very much, something like that, right? So having the signal showing the emphasis is something that would be very interesting to relay. Faithfulness beyond adequacy. So here we have the source, if an adequate translation would be, the dress is nice, it will eat a piece from you. That's an adequate translation, quote unquote. It's a weird one. Faithful translation would be, the dress is stunning, it really fits you nicely. For example, the president is close to his people. Rais قريب من شعبه would be an Arabic translation. Faithful translation would be Rais محبوب من شعبه. The president is admired by his people. Even though technically قريب من شعبه could relay some of the meaning, but the intended meaning is something around being admired by his people. So what throws people off or users of translations are what we call catastrophic translations. So bad name entity translation. So sim becomes sesame. Wrong pronouns, it, he instead of a she. Deleting critical information, profanities, dog to the bad word bitch. Implausible translations, made my day, قعدت يومي. Introduction of violent terms, oppose them, attack them. Reverse polarity, vote him out, votez pour lui, vote for him. Hallucinating unwarranted target translation, target text. So I would surmise that adequacy could serve the first three problems that we have here: bad named entity translation, wrong pronouns, deleting critical information. But faithfulness actually would go to the next level and address the rest of the problems that I just listed. So let's take a look at the examples that I shared with you earlier. So here we have some of these problems that I showed you, where the red indicates bad translations and green is what the fixes should look like. So actually here, adequacy could solve maybe 4 or 5 of these, but the other two would need to actually. So if our MVP for social media, why even think of, so if you think that adequacy is not doing a good job as an MVP for faithfulness, adequacy is not doing a good job already. So we still have challenges with the MVP, the minimum viable product, as in adequacy and fluency. Why even think about the bigger problem of faithfulness? Shouldn't we just aim for an MVP, fluency, adequacy, and then think of faithfulness? Isn't faithfulness a luxury and nice to have? I argue not, especially in subjective data, social media and opinion data, where pragmatics are crucial. For example, if you have something like super relate, silent treatment to the max, becomes super is calling, that is a big deal. Also, my bitch walked down the street versus walked my dog down the street is also a big misleading translation. And it could lead to people actually, we've seen very big ramifications. So for example, there was a problem in Facebook where a translation from Hebrew, from Arabic to Hebrew, resulted in somebody getting arrested and spending a couple of days in prison. So this is some of these things have crucial ramifications. So the challenge of pragmatic phenomena. Many of these pragmatic phenomena are high type, low token frequency. Basically, they're expressed with very high variability. So think about named entities, idiomatic expressions, neologisms, and hashtags. Social media seems to expedite new expressions being coined in the language. So it's very dynamic. And basically, it taps into the Generation Z's creativity. And the problem is exacerbated for low resource languages, such as dialectal variants. So what are some of the CL technology challenges? So for example, negation, to see negation detection. Sarcasm, how do we detect it? Humor detection and translation. How do we do quantification scope? So a lot of these things factor into their challenges in and of themselves. So how do we incorporate them and how do we get there? So let's take a look. What would it take to get there? So addressing style correspondence. Hey, you all, what's up? The faithful translation, I'm doing informal Egyptian dialect. I guess by now you know that I'm Egyptian, so my Arabic examples are mostly coming from Egyptian Arabic. So salam ya jama'a akhbarkum إيه? The adequate translation would be salam ya rifaq ma akhbarakum. So, it doesn't reflect the informality. Addressing emotion intensity. ساعات بحب آكل sushi في العشاء. The faithful translation would be sometimes like to eat sushi for dinner. The adequate translation, I love to eat sushi for dinner for hours. So, it gives you the gist of what's being said, but it doesn't reflect the nuance of the original source. Addressing belief modality. So GM may lay off workers. An adequate translation, GM ستسرح العمال, which means GM will lay off workers, as opposed to the faithful translations, GM قد تسرح العمال. So it gives you this hedging sense. Letting go, are actually during letting go. So that makes imagine how that could have implications. الفقراء بيطالبوا بحقهم في الحياة في أمريكا. The adequate translation, the deplorable people are demanding their right to life in America. The poor are demanding their rights in America. So this makes a big difference also in how you express it. So you're not hallucinating profanities. What would it take to get there? Addressing idiomatic expressions, so multi-word expressions. شفتم يا ناس فلوس العرب بتروح فين في الهواء الطلق. People, did you see where the Arab wealth goes? Into thin air. An adequate translation would be, did you see where Arab money goes? Outdoors. It's a bizarre translation. You can get the gist of it, but again, it's not faithful. يا سلام على بجاحتكم يا أخي. Wow, what audacity, dude. As opposed to, oh, peace be on your daring attitude, bro. Which is like, a weird English expression, but, again. And then finally, let me just to nail this down in terms of code switching. قدموا هون من خلال الرابط. It says apply through this link, which is an example that I showed you earlier. They arrived here through the link. Addressing code switching, so French and MSA. Sauvegarder الملف, this is Tunisian Arabic. Save the file. It should be I saved the file. So what would it take to get there? Addressing other phenomena like shorthand, LOL, TTYL, neologisms, frenemy, noob, hashtags, humor and irony, negation, quantifier, scoping, etc. What are some modeling considerations for this to actually be achieved? So there's light at the end of the tunnel, I think, addressing pragmatics in machine translation. There are lots of techniques now. So data augmentation for a specific phenomenon. There is work around neural aware machine translation, MWE aware neural machine translation, and that was presented at LREC from English to Italian, and there were 4 approaches. They looked at augmenting training data with multi-word expression parallel dictionary lists. They leveraged machine translation, MWE detection tools for the source language, then pre-processed it as a tokenization step. They also applied factored NMT on the word level by concatenating feature embeddings. And they did back translation of target leveraging usage examples, thereby augmenting training data. The results were that back translation gave you the best results. But essentially, just on the general test set, we see an improvement of 1.3, typically an improvement of 0.6 blue points is a significant improvement. So this was a nice result. And if you look specifically at data sets that have multi-word expressions, the increase was actually very pronounced, around 5.09% blue points. Style transfer. So can you control the formality of generation? And this is work that came out in 2018, and there's lots of follow-on work that we see these days, where multitask neural models for translating styles between and across languages. So they looked at French to English and Vietnamese to English, and the approach was multitask learning, where they looked at both bidirectional English formality transfer and translated XX to English with the desired formality. It's trained jointly on monolingual formality transfer data and bilingual translation data. And the results they achieved were comparable to state-of-the-art supervised side constraints integration, which is another approach, like how do you integrate this information? How do you integrate constraints to say that, you know, you want a specific type of formality level that comes out. So this is control generation. And there is other work, again, around hallucination detection in neural sequence generation. Actually, this work, sorry, this was not updated. We just got it accepted to ACL. And it's basically towards safe generation, detecting hallucination neural sequence generation. We looked at Chinese and English, and we detected hallucinations to make sure that you don't end up getting unfaithful output that's not faithful to the source. So we looked at this for neural machine translation as out of domain and low resource languages, as well as looking at this for summarization. So the results, the sentence levels hallucination using transformer-based machine translation was around 78%. And this is novel work that, you know, we sort of set the state of the art. And there's a lot more stuff going on. So there's style transfer using supervised and unsupervised and semi-supervised methods. There's emotion intensity classification. That's work with my student, Shabnam. Sarcasm detection, level of committed belief. Again, there is lots of work around these pragmatic effects. Potential solutions from enabling to machine translation modeling, similar to the negation detection, multi-word expression classification, interest and intentional code switching. There are various integration modeling techniques, side constraints, projection through parallel corpora, leveraging cross-lingual embeddings from comparable and unrelated corpora, looking at multitask learning paradigms to integrate this information. But most of these systems exist for English, or at best high resource languages. So this is another challenge. So what do you do when in this situation? Actually, an MT is already English-centric, as I mentioned earlier. A lot of these, most of even Intento's evaluations are about translation into and out of English. So the direct, there's a lack of direct communication between language 1 and language 2 if there is no pivoting through English. So machine translations typically pivot through English because there's a lack of parallel corpora, which is basically the horsepower behind all these statistical machine translation systems, whether it's neural, statistical, or what have you. So how do we mitigate the English-centric bias? And this again goes into the aspect of equitability and equity from a responsible AI perspective, and a faith and ethical awareness, pointer. So some of the possible solutions to mitigate this centric bias is to increase the pool of pivot languages with various language family representatives. So instead of having only English to pivot through, you actually have 13 to 14 language families, which exist. And they have different typologies, and many of them would be high resource by definition, but they represent different typologies in general. So they represent different languages. So you don't end up losing signal by just pivoting through English. And exploiting language relatedness in more creative ways. So we have done work in 2015 around machine translation. How did we leverage modern standard Arabic to do dialectal zero-shot translation for Arabic dialects? There are some evaluation considerations again. So everybody in the machine translation community would tell you there are lots of shortcomings to BLE. I did not go to the office, would be translated. If you have machine translation, one, I have not been to the office, is always typically done, considered much in blue, and I did go to the office. So I did go to the office is actually marked higher because it shares a lot more n-grams with the human translation. So desiderata. We'd like to create targeted data sets that reflect relevant faithfulness phenomena, develop metrics that focus on equivalence, optimizing for faithfulness rather than translation ease. So for example, we have a technology right now that's been around the literature now for almost 10 years, semantic textual similarity. References. So unfortunately, a lot of our machine translation evaluation frameworks rely on us having just one particular perspective on a translation. So to mitigate that, people say, okay, let's have 4 translations and compare against all 4 of them. But still, in reality, there are myriads of translations that could be viable and plausible. We'd like to also ground evaluation in user studies on a continuous basis. So not to have it divorced from actual usage, and perceptions of people. Invest in automated relevant enabling technologies, so for example, hallucination detection. Adopt task-based evaluation paradigms such as question answering to address critical errors. We did this in 2020 ACL with our work on fact-based, fact-based question answering for abstractive summarization, measuring the faithfulness there. Faithfulness-based. We'd like also to mitigate gender bias, so gender balanced generation. So there was work by Habash et al. That was around automatic gender identification reinflection in Arabic. And the approach that they took was to a joint neural model of gender identification and gender reinflection to create balanced empty output in Arabic. And the focus was on first person singular. And they apply as post-processing step a wrapper around the neural machine translation, and they create a gender balanced data set. And achieves a relative 8% relative BLE improvement. So this was nice work. But again, all of these solutions and considerations are for high resource languages. Where are our ethical considerations of equity and equality? So there has been interesting work around investigating this question around, low resource machine translation. So people have been looking at varying the number of examples that are being observed in the machine translation framework and seeing what the impact it would have on the performance. So there is work that came out of Facebook, which is around evaluation, and it's called Flores. And in fact, it got the Best Paper Award for data in 2019 at EMNLP. And essentially, the bottom line is it's creating this huge infrastructure data sets for languages that are extremely low resource, and they qualify low resource by the presence of digital resources for this language. So, and another solution that has been addressing this type of lingual there is, with minimal number of training examples, how much improvements can you get if you just dump all languages together in the same training paradigm? That's what's meant by multilingual training. So this shows you some of the languages. So languages that have 10 million plus data points, like German, Czech, French, Japanese, Russian, Polish, 1 million to 10 million, Finnish, Latvian, Lithuanian, Hindi, Estonian. 100K to 1 million are like Tamil, Romanian, Hebrew, Turkish, Farsi, Croatian, Arabic. 10K to 100K, like Thai, Indonesian, Swedish. 10K or less is around Marathi, Gujarati, Mongolian, Azerbaijani, Bengali. So they looked at lots and lots of languages. So there's a language data bank benchmark that's called ML50. And essentially, it's taken from the work by Tang et al. That was at NeurIPS in 2020. They show that if you have bilingual training with fine tuning versus multilingual training with a single case and multilingual fine tuning, we see improvements, especially for those languages that have very low resources. So from bilingual fine tuning, which is kind of the standard, you have for 4 to 10K, you have 11.6. It goes up to 18.9 in terms of performance. And the same thing for languages that are with a little bit higher performance, higher resources, where 10K to 100K was going from 16.8 to 22.3, and so on and so forth. So we see remarkable improvements by just adopting a paradigm where you actually put all the languages together in the same training recipe. So having said that, I hope I pointed to you that there's a lot of hope. There are lots of open challenges and opportunities to the community. What does it mean to be really model fluent? What does it really mean to model humor that doesn't transfer over? How do we deal with neologisms, noob, selfie, frenemy? Typos in the source, do we actually translate them as typos? What about shorthand and hashtags? What if they don't transfer over across languages? How do we generate? And a little nudge here, we actually have the switching workshop, and we had a shared task around machine translation, how to generate code located with NACL 20. Incoherence. And then reference translations are complicated to generate, especially for low resource scenarios. Language in implications. So that's my take-home message. Let's rise above the ending here with a lot more questions than answers, but let's shift our mindset to consider faithfulness as necessary, not optional. Let's keep our eye on the ethical dimensions of our solutions. Potentially a mindset shift from only optimizing for fluency and adequacy to optimizing for faithfulness will result in a hybridization of minimal feature engineering and representation, lending a hand to interpretability. Remember that glass box that I mentioned? Let's be creative about our evaluations and be grounded in user experience, and let's do this as a community. Okay, well, thank you very much for listening, and let this conversation begin.
Okay, thank you so much, Mona, for this amazing talk. I think I'm sure there are lots of people who have questions here. We have Dr. Hazem Al-Haj. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hello, Mona. Thank you for the presentation.
Oh, thank you.
It's always good to listen to you. I was wondering, I have not done machine translation before, so I can appreciate the challenges, and I appreciate more the faithfulness. Is the challenge, to me, my interpretation is there's an understanding and a generation part, from a modeling perspective. So the model is trying to understand what's being said in one language and then trying to generate what should be said in the other language. Do you think this miss in faithfulness is happening in the understanding or in the generation? Is it having difficulty generating the right things to say, or is it having difficulty understanding what is being said?
So we're giving too much credit to the current models, thinking that they understand anything. So let's put it this way. What I'm trying to say here is that, I think if we think about, I think the challenge is really modeling understanding. If we don't know how to model understanding well, and this is something that we're having with large language models in general, most of them are not grounded in reality or in some. So let's face it, neural machine translation as it stands today, or even statistical machine translation, is about pattern matching. And it's about, surface-to-surface strings at some level, and you just learn those correlations. So it's really a very shallow representation. My that is for we'll end up thinking about other solutions that really try to scratch the surface of understanding. Meaning, we're going to start thinking about how do we ground signal in more understanding paradigms. So we can get at that, and then the generation will follow. So really, how do we actually incorporate signals that get us closer to understanding, as opposed to sort of like the parrots situation we're living in right now. When I say parrot, I mean, like just inside, you put something in, you get something out. So it's mimicking as opposed to an actual true understanding. Does that make sense?
Okay, thank you. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you.
Omnia, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for the talk, and I'm really happy to see you again after all of these years, and to see Dr. Samha, of course, and Dr. Khalid. And your talk really motivated me to continue my work with metaphor identification, because such as sarcasm, also metaphor and idioms in translation is kind of a mess. And let me ask you one question out of curiosity. So if you were to choose only one challenge for faithfulness, what would you choose from the ones that you showed us to tackle right now?
That's a good question. So my current work is around controllable generation and uncontrollable understanding. So I'm looking a lot at these problems. Now, one challenge, that's a good question. I think evaluation, I think that's the number one precursor to everything, like how to come up with the right kind of evaluation frameworks that I could measure what, not a specific signal per se, but actually what would be the right trustworthy evaluation framework that I could adopt to say that, I'm actually measuring the right thing. And I think that's a big challenge. And figuring that out first is extremely important before even addressing how to do the modeling and so on.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, thank you so much.
No, well, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Okay, Dr. Ashraf, please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. Do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Professor Muna, good to see you again.
Likewise.
And thank you for this. I am still in the parking.
No, sorry.
So,
no, I was just kidding because I
am
wasn't
parking
sure.
on the side, and I just followed some of the lecture, which was extremely interesting. Well, you have answered one of my questions. I wanted to ask about the best metric that you could use for the faithfulness, measuring faithfulness, and whether MUs could be a potential candidate for because it handles both syntax and semantics. So that's one issue. The other issue was about this interesting concept, faithfulness. Now, you would like to capture both syntax and semantics, if I followed correctly and understood you correctly. Not only the meaning, but also the shape, the structure. When you brought awi with multiple wow, so you would like something very much works when it comes for semantics, but also you would like something maybe more expressive when it comes for very with too many R's or so. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, thanks for your questions. So as I said, evaluation is still a challenge, and we're thinking about lots of task-based evaluation rubrics. So for example, we've done this for summarization, where we looked at question answering as a framework for how to do faithful evaluation. Sorry, evaluation of faithfulness in summarization context. To your second question, I want to go beyond syntax and semantics to pragmatics. That's really the crux of what I'm saying here. Pragmatics is a branch of linguistics where they study usage, they study language use. Has metaphor, code switching, formality level, they all fall under that rubric. And my example exactly about the very or the awi was exactly about that. How can you make sure that you get the signal transferred over? But the problem is not everything is transferable. So this becomes a challenge. So I've been following a lot of these simultaneous interpreters, live, their work. And they would tell you, they would be in the middle of a conversation where they're translators between, dignitaries. And say the Russian prime minister cracks up a joke, but the joke is like not transferable to Arabic. And they sit there and they're like, okay, do we do a literal translation and then tell them laugh afterwards? Or, and this actually happens a lot. They go like, okay, this was the tenor of this, especially if it doesn't transfer over, like, it's so based in some cultural nuance that, it doesn't transfer over to Arabic by the mere fact that it's not translatable. So how do you deal with that? So these are some of the challenges that are extremely difficult to come up with. I'm also involved in the shared task for this code switching workshop, where we decided this year to do machine translation for evaluate machine translation for code switch data, meaning you have a signal, say English on the inside, on one side, and they're translating into Arabic, but you want to translate into Arabic that's code switched. Code switching means that you say, something in modern standard Arabic, followed by something in Fusha with say Egyptian, or you can do it with Egyptian and English, or Egyptian with French, or something like sauvegarde el fichier. So what I did was like we ran this with vendors that are like labeled trained linguists. And it's really interesting to see what they generated as output. So we did not give them any guidelines. We wanted to see what would they do naturally to produce code switch data. They were just told to produce code switch data. And that in itself turned out to be a really big challenge. So, this is another open area for investigation, because sociolinguists would tell you that there are patterns. People don't code switch anywhere. They code switch in certain locations. So how do you go about capturing that? And how do you go about modeling that? And how do you go about evaluating that? So there are lots and lots of challenges that I think are really interesting. And it opens up lots of PhD theses for students who are attending this, but also for us as practitioners in the field to start questioning a lot of the paradigms that we already have. Sorry, maybe this was a very long answer, but essentially it's about pragmatics. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a very clear answer. Thank you very much. But if I can add also on social media, and actually we are even experiencing this with the students. Some of my students, when they write, they say, مثلا, I will share with you my presentation. الآن مثلا هشير presentation. So when we talk about this type of structure, it's not only MSA with dialects, but also now this adds another challenge also. There are so many terms that are being used from English and being even sort of Arabized. Yani last year I had one of our faculty members. He was talking to a student on the phone, and he asked him to bring the homework to his office. That was before COVID. And he just told him, finish the homework, we bring Guhuli in the office. So at that moment, I started to think about discipline Guhuli, which system would understand and try to make the mapping and so on. So yes, you are right. There are so many challenges, especially with the code switching and so on. Again, thank you very much for the presentation and your input.
Thank you so much. You should attend our workshop on Friday, next Friday. I think it's open.
Inshallah, inshallah.
So you see a lot of us discussing a lot of these issues, especially on the morphology level. It's really interesting.
That would be great. Thank you.
Who says ish?
Dr. Hussein, Hassan, sorry.
Close the door. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much today, Dr. Mona Diab, about your great presentation. My name Hassanin Al-Barhamtoushi. If you remember
of course
me.
I know. Yeah, أهلا وسهلا.
Thank you. Allah يسلمكم. I am still in King Abdulaziz University in Kingdom of Saudi Arabia at Jeddah town. And therefore, we need to look at machine translation for all. What we mean by all? We mean that all peoples, for special needs people, that related to deaf people, blind people, autism people, dyslexia people, scientific people, to cover all the specific domains actually over the world. Therefore, to look at a general machine translation to work with what you prefer, Dr. Mona, about the three pillars we have, الدعامات الثلاثة, that is related to the first one, the data itself, data set. The data, this is the first pillar. We need to create something like parallel dictionary that include all the languages we have. And in added to the special needs people we need to work with, like deaf people as a signer, as a sign language, as a talk, as a speech, something like that. Therefore, we need to create the parallel dictionary first, or to create some corpuses or some corpora to work with different languages, and also to create what we call by lexicon creation, according to, it's like WordNet or something like that. This is the first pillar. Second one, to work with, to train our machine, we have feature extraction that related to sequences, to sequence or encoder, decoder, or something like that. The last one is related to the model itself we need. Which one we will start with for the first one, or second one, or third one, Dr. Mona?
So basically, you packed a lot of questions into this one, right?
Yes. Yes. You prefer to start with the data set? Yeah. Especially for Arabic.
But text to speech is, sorry, yeah. Are you saying something? Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. I need to make sure that people get the message across. The point that I was trying to make here, it actually transfers over to, like, you know, thinking about universal translations, thinking about translations for the people with disabilities. Absolutely. You know, people who have, you know, and that's part of the reason there's a lot of investment from industry and academia around speech-to-speech translation, because in reality, that's really the modality that most people use. People, you know, you need a certain level of literacy to actually access text-to-text, but speech-to-speech tends to be the more, you know, natural way of doing things. Now, people with dyslexia, people with mental health issues, absolutely, that's also another area. So, but do they have, like, how do we address this? So I have another line of my work with students where we look at schizophrenia and mental health. And we show that there are differences in language, there are differences in signal, differences in the way they deal with language. Should we have dedicated data sets to them? By all means, absolutely. But then it needs to be a concerted effort. I think it's not just one pillar that needs to be addressed. In order to do anything successfully, you need to think in terms of ecosystems, where you have the data, the modeling, and the evaluation. And of course, each one of these would have its own desiderata. So my thinking is, I don't think it's a fair question to say, invest in this only. Now, in terms of invest in which first, as I always say, figure out what your problem is, so the what, and then figure out how to evaluate it, understand the current status of our systems, and then invest in, you know, bridging the gaps. And data is definitely one big cursor, one big aspect of this. But then the modeling as well, it's not just about creating data. So the modeling as well plays a role. And actually our paper this year from 2021, which just got accepted to ACL, you see it coming out in ACL this year, is about, you know, even if you keep the data static and your evaluation framework is static, we actually noted there are algorithmic biases depending on what optimization you choose to speed up your algorithms for machine translation. So we show this, you know, with even though technically speaking, the metric that we have, bleu is not sensitive to that. So my point here is when you think about addressing these problems, you always user distrust for the problems that we're trying to address. Does that answer your question?
Yes,
Dr.
thank you very much. Thank you. We have many of challenges. Yes.
Lots of challenges. That's part of the reason I say let's have the conversation.
Yes,
again.
yes, I know, but we need to make it in real applications. This is the point.
Exactly. I mean, that's part of the reason I'm in industry at this point.
Yeah.
It's basically to know, whatever technology we come up with does really affect 3 billion people, 3 billion users.
Yeah.
So
thank you very much.
Yeah.
Mona, do you have time for?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I just want to tell all attendees, it's not just the questions that are open to them as well, not just for panelists. So if anyone has a question, please go ahead and raise your hand. And also there are quite a few people watching on YouTube. So if you type your questions, I'll be happy to read them to Dr. Mona. Until I see someone raising their hand, I have a quick question. Mona, when you were talking about this faithfulness in machine translation, I couldn't but help thinking about the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where there's this babblefish, and it's embedded the way it translates is by understanding what the person is trying to say. So I just felt that of course it would be great if what you're dreaming of becomes a reality, and you did indicate that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. But a lot of the things that you've demoed today or you've shown us today are very difficult to do. So realistically, how long do you think, or when do you think we might get there?
So I think that it's not too far off if you follow the current literature. So for example, I don't want to say these are solved problems, but right now, for example, there's a lot of really nice headway that we're seeing around, for example, sarcasm and argument mining and metaphor detection and metaphor generation. I've been seeing in the current, in 2021, there is work by Miranda Morashan from Columbia University. There's also work from UW, from University of Washington in Seattle, where they're doing really, really interesting work around grounding in social biases, grounding in, trying to understand. It was within a specific paradigm of generation, which is language models. But now language models are becoming sort of like the de facto sort of like precursor to any of the modeling that we're doing. So, barring scale issues that have to do with these language models, there's a lot of work around how to incorporate and inject knowledge into these kinds of paradigms so that we get closer to a notion of understanding. So I don't see it as too far off. I feel like, especially us as the Arab community and people in the Middle East, where we have, this is a problem area where we can be on par with American institutions and Chinese institutions, which is really the two big competitors in this space. So, how do you do knowledge infusion in smart ways? How do you, leverage where to inject knowledge, and what kind of knowledge needs to be injected? Is an open space, an open area for research, and is gaining traction. So, in the past 5 years, it was like all about scale. Now it's becoming like, okay, let's take this down a little bit because of, ethical considerations. Becoming consumption, sustainability, accessibility. Only big companies, for example, this is a big thing that we have in the US. A lot of people are complaining, and rightfully so. Academia is so shortcut because it just doesn't have access to these machinery. Like, we don't have the TPUs and the GPUs that exist in industry. And a lot of the people are moving to industry because they want to express at a is hybridized systems. at least find that. How to do knowledge in the right places, right? What kind of knowledge, where to inject it, and to inject it. So, so this paradigm, I feel like it's something that is going to be the coming wave, and I feel like we can have a role to play there.
Thank you.
Linguistic perspective, Arabic is so extremely a microcosm of NLP that it has, you know, if you solve it for Arabic, you would have solved it for lots of other languages. So
I'm sorry, there's something that seems to be wrong with my connection.
Are you saying something?
No. Sorry, Mona. Did I interrupt you because you broke up? I wasn't.
No.
Okay. Sorry.
Did you hear me at all?
Yeah,
I don't know.
I heard most of it, but by the end you broke up a little bit. For me, at least, I don't know if it's my connection. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I heard until you said that if we solve it for Arabic, we'll solve it for all other languages. So this is.
Yeah, I feel like Arabic is a microcosm of NLP, to be honest, and that's part of the reason I was in. I mean, apart from the fact that I speak it natively, but it's a microcosm of lots of NLP challenges. And then there's the other aspect of this. Grounding could be also thought about in multimodal terms. So addressing some of Dr. Barham Tushi's questions around multimodality, you know, like my focus today was on text, but in reality, you can think about other signals, right? You know, like images, videos, speech, you know, OCR. There are lots and lots of aspects that could be incorporated in terms of grounding. So that's something that also I think the community is moving towards as well. So multimodality.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you so much, Mona. Okay, this is everyone's last chance. If you have a question, it's now or never. So if you need to raise your hand. Okay, Mona, I can't thank you enough for this amazing talk and for your time. It was a real pleasure having you here today with us. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Mona. It's really
your attention and great question. Appreciate it so much.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
جزاكم الله كل خير.